So our guest speaker today is Zaki Hamid. He teaches Introduction to Mass Media and Film here at Everett Community College. And he's also a program director at Humanities Washington, which is the organization I used to work at and where we first met. During our time together, Zaki and I did a lot of humanities-based programming around the state, often delving into the issue of the media and diversity and why diversity is important to media. Zaki is a powerful speaker on this subject, and I'm honored to have him here today to share this presentation with you. With that, take it away, Zaki.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Everyone doing all right? All right, good. Sun is out. Good day. So, to give you just a little bit of background of who I am and what I do, I was born and raised in the Middle East, in Jordan. I come from Palestinian heritage. I lived in Beirut, Lebanon, right after the Civil War for a couple of years. That was a very interesting couple of years of my life. And I emigrated to the United States in 1994, and I've been here ever since. When I emigrated, I went to New York, lived there for about 6 years. I am a community college product. I started out with just taking classes here and there in Troy, New York, just trying to get my bearing. And then I took enough credits to transfer to the University at Albany. It's a state university of New York there. And from there, I was lucky enough to get a full scholarship, or fellowship rather, to go to the University of Delaware, where I got my master's degree there in theater. And I've traveled the country a little bit and then settled in Seattle in 2003. So today I want to talk a little bit about diversity in the media, and I have some personal stories I'm going to share with you as well. But I'm coming at this from the point of view that it is important. I'm not here to debate whether or not diversity is important in media in general. I come from the point of view it is important, and we want to talk to you about why I think that. And towards the end, I would love to get your questions on this topic. So we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about diversity in the news media, and then we're going to switch and talk about diversity in film and TV as part of the larger mass media. All right? So let's start out with just some simple demographics. This is the US population. In 1970, 83% of the population of the United States was white. Only 17% were deemed people of color. That starts to change in 2014, 38 to 62. By 2060, and actually this will come a lot sooner than 2060, we're looking about 2040 or so, where the United States will become what is known a minority majority country, right? So that it will happen by about 2040 or so. But so I just wanted to put this as this. These are the demographics of the United States as it is right now. So let's talk some more statistics. Let's talk about the print dailies. 83% of people who work in print dailies, right? Print dailies, meaning daily newspapers. 83% are white. Only 17% are deemed people of color. In the digital realm, it gets a little bit better there, 77% versus 23%. Still, it's a big gap, right? So the vast majority of the people that are giving you your news are of Caucasian origin. So let's talk about the reasons for this disparity. Why do you think that there's such a big disparity? Anybody want to throw something out? Is it that people of color seriously just don't like journalism? Anybody think that? No? All right. There are lots of reasons for it, but I'm going to just concentrate on a couple here. This is a quote here from the Atlantic, one of my favorite magazines, and there's an article that says, newsrooms often value the types of internships and experiences that minorities are less likely to have. What does that mean? All right, here, what it means is that people of color are less likely to attend schools that have campus newspaper or are less likely to join them, right? So there's a big disparity in neighborhoods and schooling. So that really enters into it. So if a school in a poor neighborhood that doesn't have the kind of resources that a rich neighborhood's going to afford, then they're going to have less opportunities to delve into something like a school newspaper, right? So you take a school in the Bronx somewhere, for instance, and you compare it with a school in Issaquah. That's going to be a big disparity in the kind of funding that's going to that school. So that's just one of the reasons there that they might attend schools that don't really have these kind of activities, and that's because of the racial disparity that we have in the United States. That's a whole other topic. I can talk about that for ages, but that's not what we're here to do. And the other thing is unpaid internships. Who can afford to get an unpaid internship? Somebody who comes from a wealthy family, maybe, right? So that they can do it. Say, hey, I'm going to take this internship at the Seattle Times, and that's okay because I don't need to work to get money. My parents have it. So that means that we have the wealthier families are able to send their kids to have unpaid internships and really benefit from that. But somebody who has to go to school and then go back and work a couple of jobs is not going to happen. That happened with me. When I moved to the United States, I was working full-time and still trying to go to school and get as many credits as I can. So I didn't have time for any kind of unpaid internship because if I'm not at school, I was at either Burger King or a pizza parlor somewhere or retail, whatever it is that I was cobbling together jobs just to kind of make a living. So it's really hard. Now, I went to Washington, D.C. one time to Congress to lobby for funding for the humanities, and I was really struck by the staff of all the Congress people. They're all interns. And it's unpaid internships. So these are the people who kind of start out there and then they move to become staff members and all this. So I really figured out that the country is really run by these staff members. Where these staff members start out, unpaid internships. Who can afford unpaid internships? People who come from wealthier means. So that's just some of these reasons for that kind of disparity. So now we come to the heart of it. Why is it important? Why is it important to have diversity in newsrooms? So I'm going to give you a few examples here. In that same Atlantic article, the writer says, fewer minorities are getting the opportunity to work in news, and news organizations are losing their ability to empower, represent, and especially in cases where language ability is crucial, even to report on minority populations in their communities. So that leaves us with coverage that could be biased, that could be tone deaf, right? Or simply incomplete, right? Does that make sense? Now those possibilities, the article also says, those possibilities are especially troubling as the country's complex and often ugly relationships among people of different races, cultures, ethnicities, and religions are pushed to the forefront of the American conscience. Okay? So because of that, I want to tell you a story here. But before I do that, anybody know this writer? Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie? You know her? Good for you. I love that author. She is awesome. She wrote this amazing book called Americana. It is really one of the best novels I've read in a long, long time. But she has a TED Talk called The Dangers of a Single Story. I highly, highly recommend that you see that. In it, she says a couple of things that I think are interesting. One, she says the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. Which means that takes us to the dangers of an incomplete story. So here's my story about that. A lot of you here are pretty young, so probably don't really remember what happened minute to minute or hour to hour on 9/11. Anybody really remember these details? Some people do. You do? Yeah? So here's what happened to me is I was going to grad school, and I left the house. I used to wake up every morning, watch a little bit of CNN or maybe Sports Center, and then I would go to school. We started at 9:30 every day. So I left the house before anything had happened. I get to school, and we had this green room where we had a computer. We call it a green room. This is where actors hang out usually before productions, but that was our hangout. And everybody was gathered around this computer, and somebody said, you know, there's a plane that hit the World Trade Center. So, okay, we're seeing some of these images. Didn't know what's going on, but we went to class. During class, the wife of our teacher comes in, and she looks at her husband, our teacher, says, come home. Please come home. And we were all like, I don't know what was going on. The director of the program comes, says, classes are suspended for the day. There's something that happened in New York. So I go to the student center, and there's these big TVs, and I'm watching this. What makes this even more emotional for me is I was living in New York before Delaware, and I just became a citizen 2 months before that. 2 months. On July 3rd of 2001, I got my citizenship, and it was the proudest day of my life. Ever since I was a little kid, growing up in Jordan, all I wanted to do was be in the United States. I wanted to become an American. I believed in the ideals of America for multiple reasons. So I became a citizen, proud as proud can be. And then something like this happens. And it was devastating. I can't remember a day that was more devastating to me than that day. Watching those towers go down on those screens in the Student Center in Delaware was one of the most devastating days of my life. Not only because I was a proud American, but it's because I came from an Arab and Muslim background. I didn't know how to feel. The place that I came from, that kind of society, created something so ugly that led to 9/11. And yet here I am, a new American, proud as can be. I didn't know how to feel. So like most people, I turned to TV, watching the news, watching CNN, seeing what's going on. All I'm hearing is terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Arab equals bad, Muslim equals bad. That's all of these messages that I'm getting at this point. So the next day, me and my roommate were on the balcony, and we had a Muslim family that lived in our building. And the woman was a devout Muslim woman. She always wore her hijab. She had a little kid. And for the first time, I saw her outside playing in this green area with her kid without her hijab. So I look at my roommate and says, why do you think that is? What would compel a devout Muslim woman to take off her hijab in public? Fear. She was scared. She was scared of the kind of retaliation that she might get just because she was wearing a hijab. So when I say that the story of 9/11 is not complete, that's what I mean. There weren't stories saying how Muslim Americans were feeling. There weren't stories talking about how new Americans from the Middle East, like me, were feeling. Stories weren't reported like a story about somebody chasing my dad down a parking lot at a Walmart shouting, "You effing Arab, go back to where you came from." That was not really reported on. Nobody's writing stories about how I felt when I saw a big truck pass by with the words, "Nuke them all," right on there. The reason that these stories weren't told is because there weren't enough prominent journalists that come from an Arab background or a Muslim background that were able to write these kind of stories. So the story of 9/11 to me is incomplete because it reported, for the main part, on one aspect of what happened, and it didn't for the other. So it didn't give us that perspective. It didn't give us how people in our own country, our own countrymen and women, were feeling. We only got one perspective. And that, I believe, is very dangerous. Let's go to another example. So I have a friend of mine named Dean Obidallah. He writes for CNN and Huffington Post, and this is during the campaign. Everybody remember who Khizr Khan was? Anybody remember him? Khizr Khan, he went to the Democratic Convention and famously got a copy of the Constitution out of his pocket and said to our current president now, saying, "Have you ever read the Constitution? If you haven't, I have a copy for you." Right? It was an attack on him. But the reason for that is because this is an immigrant Muslim family, and their kid, Khizr Khan's kid, was in the military and he died in Afghanistan, right? So, but there was an ad that came and it showed Khizr Khan in a very positive light. So my friend here, Dean, said Hillary Clinton's Khizr Khan campaign ad finally gives American Muslims the humanity they deserve. It's one of the few times on national TV that Muslims can tune in and see a reflection of them as American heroes rather than terrorists. That means a lot. It means a lot to the people who give their best to this country every single day. But that was such an iconic moment that he felt he had to write about it. I can't believe it. There was something positive about a Muslim on TV, right? We don't quite see that. Another example here, who knows O.J. Simpson? Okay, we got a few people who know O.J. So this is an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates. If you don't know Ta-Nehisi Coates, I highly recommend you give him a read. He is one of the most brilliant minds of our time. He has a great book called Between the World and Me. If you really want to understand race issues in America, read Between the World and Me. But he wrote this article, says what O.J. Simpson means to me. So in this article, he was wondering, why is it that the black community was so behind O.J. during this trial, even though O.J. was distancing himself from the black community? O.J. Simpson famously said, I'm not black, I'm O.J. So Ta-Nehisi Coates is going, I just don't get it. I don't get why my community is so behind this guy. He doesn't want us. So he goes through this article, and at the end of it, he gets to the point of, well, you can't look at the O.J. Simpson trial without looking at what happened with the LA riots a few years ago. He kind of tied it all together there. And for somebody who might not be immersed into that community, might not get that point of view. The same reason that they made that documentary, it was like an 8-hour documentary on ESPN, Made in America, O.J. Simpson, yep. If that is one of the most amazing documentaries I've ever seen. It won the Oscar for Best Documentary. And if you watch that, you really understand certain issues about race and race issues in America. But the thing is, if you don't have enough people telling these stories, you might not get that perspective. So my wife is not a person of color. She is Caucasian. She's from Idaho. And when we watched that together, she was going, I can't believe this. I never even thought of this before. Now, there's a great moment in that documentary where there was the prosecution added a black lawyer the day before they started. And we got a lot of flack for that. Like, oh, you're just adding a black lawyer now because it's O.J. and all that. But during the trial, he went to argue a point. There was a cop that the defense was trying to say that he planted evidence. He was a white cop. And they had these tapes of this white cop saying incredibly racist things, including saying the N-word again and again and again. And they wanted to submit it as evidence. This is a racist cop, which means he probably could have planted evidence. So the prosecution goes up, and they say, we can't have this as admitted evidence because this jury, who is the majority black, all black, I believe, if they hear that and they hear the repeated N-word again and again, they're going to shut down. And they're not going to be able to give this a proper and fair hearing because all they're going to hear is the N-word and they're going to go, that's it, I can't really, they're going to shut down. So the editor-in-chief of the LA Times was there, he was interviewed on this, and he goes, wow, I looked at this and said, absolutely, that is absolutely right, I didn't think of that. When this jury hears that, they're going to shut down. But right next to him, one of his reporters, who happens to be African American, and her reaction was, can you believe this? Can you believe how insulting that is to think that we, African Americans, cannot give something a fair hearing just because we hear the N-word? That is just plain insulting. Then he looks at the camera and goes, as an aside, folks, that's why you need diversity in the newsroom. It gives you a completely different perspective, right? So that's just one of those stories. Okay, so I'm going to move on a little bit now to just talk about gender and TV in film, about these kind of disparities, all right? So again, let's go through the statistics rather quickly. These are speaking roles on screen. Anybody who has lines on a screen. In film, only 28.7% of all speaking lines go to women. A little bit better in broadcast, then you have cable, streaming, and the total out of it all, 33.5% of speaking roles on TV go to women. The rest go to men. By the way, we have more women than men in the United States. So that's the first disparity there. This one also does with age. Characters 40 years of age and older, okay? So anybody who is going to play a character that is over 40, 78.6% of that go to men. Only 21.4 go to women, which means that if you are a woman in TV, you better get your stuff done before you hit 40, because all of a sudden those roles are going to start disappearing. Broadcast, cable, streaming. You can see that streaming always does better than film, mainly better than anybody else so far, but there's still a big disparity. Now behind the camera, this floors me. How many can name a female director? Throw a male director at me. Steven Spielberg. Scorsese. All right. So it's easy, right? Anybody can name a female director?
Well, she was an actress first, but Angela Mitchell.
Okay.
Tina Fey and Amy Poehler.
Yeah, good. They're directors, yeah.
Reese Witherspoon just recently directed something.
Okay, she's getting into it. Good. They started off as these are all, started as actresses and then kind of moved on, right? But it's hard for us to name just, female directors that's all they do, right? So look at that. That's 3.4% of directors in film are women. Broadcast, cable, streaming, broadcast doing a little bit better there. Writing, same thing. Film, broadcast, cable, streaming, you have all these statistics here. Very, very low, the writing staff. So right now we have the vast majority of directors are men. The vast majority of writers are men, and speaking lines mostly go to men. Show creators. Of course, show creators is somebody who runs the whole show at a TV show, right? If you really want to know what the money is, show directors or show creators. Same thing. You can see the numbers of males and females here. Very big disparity. So I'm just kind of moving quickly by those so we can get to the point, why does that matter? But now we've looked about gender, let's look at race. So, underrepresented speaking characters. They kind of lumped all people who are underrepresented, right? So could be, any race, could be, African American or Asian or Middle Eastern and so forth. They kind of lumped them together, and you can see the disparity here between underrepresented speaking characters. Sears regulars, leads by media platform, right? Very, very big disparity. Within that racial disparity, there's still a gender disparity. Does that make sense? Right? So character gender within the racial and ethnic groups, so 65.7% white for males. So even within underrepresented characters, there's still a big gender disparity going on. So here, same thing with LGBT characters. Of 11,194 speaking characters, only 158 were gay, 17 bisexual, 49 lesbian, and 7 transgender. That's still a big, big disparity there. Okay, now let's get to why is this important? So it ties in to a lot of things that we discussed with the news media, which means that TV and film are creating almost an alternative universe that simply doesn't look like us. If you see the average TV show, it's not going to look like this room. It's going to look a lot different, right? Let me tell you another story here. So I was in New York, and I was an actor. And I will admit, I went there to play certain roles, right? I went there, I'm like, man, terrorism is hot right now. I'm going to get these roles. I'm going to cash in, right? So I even get a headshot of me looking really angry. You know, grew some facial hair. I was there to really exploit my ethnicity, and I was in for a rude awakening. So because of that, of course, all the roles I was sent on were either terrorists, hot dog vendors, cab drivers, all of these stereotypes. So one time, I went and I played a hot dog vendor and all that, and so I go in the next day, not next day, but a week later, they call me in for another commercial. Right? Okay, I booked one commercial, I'll probably get another. Like, this one's a cab driver, you know, this was for a network for the New York Mets. It was a brand new TV network for the New York Mets. And I go in and I start the audition, and they stop me like, whoa, 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 stop. No, we want you to do the accent. That's why you're here. I'm like, oh, I thought it was just a cab driver, silly me. So I had to, you know, put on this accent like this, like, oh, hello, my friend, how are you, and all of that stuff, right? But then what really did it for me, I went in for an audition for a movie on Spike TV. Okay, anybody know Spike TV? It's a horrible channel. So this was a Christmas movie about Osama bin Laden hijacking Christmas. It was supposed to be a comedy. So I go there and they give me the script, and I'm looking at it, and there's a song. All right, the song is Santa Claus is coming to town. We all know this, right? Santa Claus is coming, right? Except that the lyrics were Osama is coming to town. So the scene, my audition scene, was I tied up Santa Claus, okay? And I'm singing, Osama is coming to town, right? So I do this audition, and I'm feeling so humiliated. And then the guy goes, do you speak Arabic? I'm like, I do. So he hands me this sheet of paper. He said, great, we want you not to do it in Arabic. I look at it, it doesn't make any sense. In Arabic, all the letters are connected. This one looks like he just went to Google Translate or something, and it's just a bunch of letters next to each other, which don't make any sense. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. He was like, why don't you just translate it and then do it? I'm like, okay. So I'm sitting there, and I'm translating and everything, and then I just paused, and I realized that this is not for me. And I just got up and I left. And I never did TV again. That was it. I was like, I'm out. I can't do this. This kind of representation of who I am and where I come from is not healthy. Because what it does, it leads to lack of empathy, leads to dangerous situations, and it could even lead to death. Right? There's these two kids in North Carolina. They were going to school there, to college, a couple of years ago, and they were killed by a man living in their apartment. They were Muslim. They were engaged, Muslim Americans, and I think they tried to brush it off as some kind of parking dispute. But it was very clear from some of the things that the guy who killed them that he had very negative views of who they were and where they came from. Where do we get this idea? We get it in everyday life. When we open a newspaper, that's what we're seeing. When we turn on the TV, that's what we're seeing. When we look at movies, that's what we're seeing. And I say this is dangerous. And circling back to that quote by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she says, it's not that stereotypes are untrue, it's just that they are incomplete. Are there Arab and Muslim people who are horrible human beings that are creating, just complete and utter horror in the world? Sure there are. Are they more than that 1%? No. The vast majority of people just go about their lives. But sometimes we are defined by that stereotype. I mean, I work with a guy who, good friend, and he teaches at Bellevue College. And he talks about his son. His son, they're African American, and his son is a big dude. He is a big dude. He is a big 15-year-old dude, right? 6'3", something like that, right? So my friend always talks about how scared he is for his son. Why? Because he's a big black dude. Just by how we assign these roles to certain people based on what is projected at us, it makes it dangerous. So that's why I think that diversity in all forms of media is really important. So we can get an accurate representation of who we are, who our neighbors are, who our friends are, and maybe, just maybe, right, we can start building better relationships with each other and better understand each other. We can only do that if we read and see stories that reflect a point of view other than our own, right? So, questions? Who's got questions? Yeah.
Like, do you have any suggestions for how we can fix this? Like, who can we give our money to support, like, diversity in media and all platforms in general?
Good question. So let me start by this. Let's start on an individual basis. Do you read? You like reading? You like reading books?
I do, yeah.
How many of those are female writers, do you think, on average?
Not enough. Not enough.
People of color, same thing, do you think?
Several of my favorite books are people of color, but probably, I'm sure it's mostly white.
Yeah. How about newspapers? Do you read newspapers?
I do, yeah. I don't really, yeah, the people that I get my news from are definitely more white people.
Yeah, and it's not like that's a shame or anything. That's
Yeah,
just the fact that most people that are there are white. A lot of my favorite writers in newspapers are white, but that's the way it kind of falls. So my suggestion is, on a personal level, is always to expand kind of your worldview. So for me, for instance, last year, I said I'm going to go on a project that I'm only going to read books written by people of color. I'm not going to read any white authors, right? Nothing against the white authors. It's just that I realized that the majority of the books that I'm reading are written by white authors. So I said, I need to expand that worldview. And I started going on this journey. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. And the more I read, the more I understood. I understood, like, oh, I see what that experience is like. And all of a sudden, I'm able to talk about it when I talk with, either with just in a regular conversation, if I'm teaching, if I'm giving any kind of speech. I have an expanded worldview. So that is my first suggestion, is to start with yourself. Read as much as you can people who don't look like you, who might not, who come from different parts of the world. And the more you understand that worldview, the more your critical thinking skills will start to develop. The second thing is demand, right? So there's something about demanding these, for better representation. Whether that's through social media, there are campaigns that are going on. And remember Oscars So White? Remember that, when everybody was really outraged that none of the nominees were people of color, they were all white? That was 2 years ago. So that created an outrage. And somebody created a hashtag, Oscars So White, and that took off like wildfire. So what the Academy ended up doing is changing who gets to nominate people and really making it more inclusive. And this year, we had a number of people very well deserving of nominations. And of course, you had Moonlight, which is really one of the most beautiful films that I've seen in I don't know how many years. All of these things could not have been possible if people didn't speak up. So you have two things you can do. One, you can start with yourself and your worldview, and two, really speaking up and demanding these kinds of things. Questioning, always questioning. If there's a newspaper you really like and there's a point of view that's missing, you have a voice. You can talk to them and say, how come this is not represented? Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not saying, I guess in a way, this is kind of, I've been trying to think of how to word this. Do you think that, because I'm relating back to your story where you were acting and you were talking about being like, oh, I'm gonna have this persona of me. Do you think the assumption of, or you assuming the assumption of people thinking that all people are bad has a bad portrayal on them in the first place, because you took that upon yourself to wear that image when you could have fought against that image?
Yeah.
So do you think that's kind of a lot of it?
I
Or do
did
you
that.
think that some do and some don't?
Yeah, I mean, I did that because when I looked at TV and film, that's what I saw coming at me. So as an actor, you always go, where do I fit in, right? Am I the geeky kid? Am I the heartthrob? You know, there's always these stereotypes, and you always fall into one. No matter when you start acting, you're always like, you're the geeky kid. So all of a sudden, that's all you're going for. Or you're the heartthrob, or whatever it is. When I looked at that and I said, what is there for me in film and television of somebody who has darker skin, who can obviously I know other languages, I know Middle Eastern languages, and I can do really good accents. So what is there for me? And the one thing that was coming back is the terrorist roles. Have you ever, like 23 or 24? Remember that show? I know there's a weird version of it right now, but back then it was really, really popular. 24, the first iteration of it. Every episode it had another terrorist on there. It had so many terrorists on there that they were casting for that in Seattle because they were running out of people who can play these roles in LA, for God's sake. So I looked at that and said, that's where I fit in. And I said, that's how I can make money. I didn't really want to, but I said, if I do that, maybe I will get to a place where I'm good enough that I can do other things. But it wasn't a good experience. It was an awful experience. It was humiliating. And as I'm auditioning for these, I realized that this is not where I want to go. If other people want to do that, more power to you. Everybody's got to make a living somehow. I just decided I want to make it somewhere else. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously, with the state of the U.S. right now, we kind of have a leader who has publicly bashed Muslims and Arabs and whatnot. Do you think, would you say that a huge problem with him is the fact that he uses the word all excessively too much?
Anybody who uses the word all excessively is going to be a problem because you're casting a really wide net. So yeah, I do have a problem with anybody saying African Americans are like this, Arabs are like this, Muslims are like this, especially when you say Muslims, because with Muslims, it's 1.6 billion people of the world are Muslim, right? The Middle East actually has the least amount of Muslims. Indonesia has the most. It's not Saudi Arabia, right? And it's very, very different. And for in case of to give an example of diversity within that religion, you can have at one end of the spectrum somebody who is like ISIS, right? And the other end of the spectrum, someone like me who simply does not believe in any of it. And there's everything else in between. So if we're just going to cast a wide net and say them, right, it's going to be a really, really big problem. It's going to be a bigger problem if somebody has the bully pulpit. Somebody can go either through Twitter or through, whatever, State of the Union address, anything like that, and just proclaim something like that. Yes, it's going to be damaging, yeah.
Yeah, because I think the one thing I've always said is it isn't right to punish a whole group for actions of abuse.
Yeah.
And what I thought was extremely interesting is with someone I was talking to, they had asked my opinion about that, and I told them it's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And they said to me, life isn't fair. And I was like, okay, it's easy to say when you're not the one in their shoes. And I was like, flip your.
Well, exactly. And this is times why you need these stories to be written or filmed or whatever about these experiences, because these allow you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. So by telling you a story today about how I reacted to 9/11, I'm allowing you to step into my shoes and see maybe, hopefully, it was a different perspective for you. Something like, oh, I didn't think about how it affected so-and-so in the past. And in terms of it's not fair, it's not. Nothing is fair in life. But we always strive for fairness. I don't think it's enough to just say, hey man, life ain't fair, so that's it. No, we have to strive for fairness. Yeah. But it is a problem, and I think the more you read about these experiences, the more that you will understand. And that goes for me too, for instance, right? So when I came to the States, I had to understand the Caucasian lifestyle in order to live. I needed to know how everybody lives, so I had to immerse myself in that. And I have a much better understanding of that. And I have a much better understanding of the people who vote certain ways. Did I vote for Donald Trump? I didn't. I'll admit it. I'm not afraid to say it. I didn't vote for him. I don't like the guy. Am I going to demonize people who voted for him? No. I'm sure everybody had their reasons. I'd be more than happy to sit down and talk and empathize and have a conversation as Americans. That kind of love of country that I had when I came here and became an American, I still have it today, every day. This is where my loyalty lies. Yeah.
Can you empathize with people who use, just say someone say that I don't like Hispanics. Can you empathize with someone's reason being that, and so they hear what Trump has to say and they go, yes, that's my guy?
It's a tough question to answer. I'm all about inclusion. And I've seen people who look at me and say, we don't want you in our country, right? The trick is, how do you react to it? Do you become more belligerent? Or do you take the high road? I'd much rather take the high road on that. So we got, so 1, 2, and 3. Go ahead.
So what brought you to America? Why not like Canada or Sweden or some other country?
Well, first of all, America exports everything out more than any other country, right? So you're going to get more American exports than Canadian, stuff like that. When I mean exports, I'm talking fast food, I'm talking TV, all of that stuff, right? So that's all that came at us. You know, we didn't get Canadian shows, we got American shows. We didn't get what's that Canadian equivalent of Dunkin' Donuts? What do they have in Canada? Tim Hortons. We didn't have Tim Hortons, right? But we got Dunkin' Donuts. So I had family in the United States as well. I also had them in Canada, actually. I have some people who are Canadian, cousins and uncles, and so our family was kind of split, but really all over the world. Some went to France, but America excited me the most. As a little kid, I mean, it was very superficial. It was about good cereal and Saturday morning cartoons and all of that. But as I grew up, the one thing that I love about, there's so many reasons, but the number one thing is the First Amendment. No other country in the world constitutionally guarantees freedom of the press and freedom of speech. But we do. And I take that to heart. Because when I lived in Jordan, you couldn't say what you wanted. The joke was always, you look behind your shoulders before you made any kind of disparaging comment about the government, because somebody might be listening, you might disappear, right? So freedom of speech is very, very important to me. It's one of the most important things in the world for me. And the United States guarantees it in the Constitution. No other country does that. And so that's one of those reasons. Yes?
I just wanted to add, so I'm a Mexican woman, and I had never experienced any sort of like direct racism until these recent elections. It was just, I was so thrown off. I was like, whoa, like the way it made me feel, I had never felt so like, I have no words for it, but it was just so interesting to see. Like, but I was born and raised here. I was like, American, so I'm Mexican American, but it was just interesting.
And I'll tell you what motivates a lot of this. Fear.
Yeah.
We fear those we do not know. So we create stories, we create narratives around who those people are, and we become really afraid. So for me, somebody could be really scared of Muslims and Arabs. But my guess is, if we sat down and had a conversation, they might not be afraid. I mean, look at me. You know what I mean? I'm not threatening. You know what I mean?
I was just a cashier for them. I was like, okay.
You know what I mean? If somebody would push me and I'd fall down. I'm not. That's just who I am. But there's a narrative that around that, and I think if we address that fear, we get to the heart of these problems. It's not that these are bad people; it's that they have bad information, and maybe they even had a bad experience. But I think fear is a big motivator. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, when it comes to empathizing with someone who says like, oh, I don't like Hispanics, or I don't like Muslims, or the LGBT community, or something like that, it's, maybe to understand that that is because of fear or because of misinformation and more of like a product of their environment. You know, like if they're raised to feel a certain way, they
Right.
might continue that belief.
And I'm going to give you an example of that. So because I said my family's Palestinian, and you might not know too much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been going on since 1948. But I'm a son of refugees. My mom lived in a refugee camp for 13 years in the West Bank before they finally went to Jordan, and that's where I was born. They had property, they had homes that they lost to new settlers who became Israelis. So naturally, they harbored some really negative feelings towards Israelis and Jews. That's the environment in which I was brought up. And it wasn't until I was in Lebanon and I met a guy from France, oddly enough, walking around the Middle East looking for heavy metal bands, like Middle Eastern heavy metal bands. I used to work at a radio station, so we had a great conversation. So he introduces me to a DJ somewhere in the United States. I didn't know the United States back then. I just said, hey, a DJ in America, this is awesome. So this guy would call me every once in a while on the phone and we would talk because he was fascinated about like, wow, there are heavy metal bands like in Lebanon? Like, and you listen to that music? So one time he calls and he says, do you mind if we do a three-way call? Me, you, and there's this musician from Tel Aviv in Israel. I kind of froze. I didn't know because I was brought up with so many prejudices against that. And I said, yeah, let's do it. You know, I'm taking a leap here. And for the first time in my life, I was 18 at that point, I talked to somebody who was Jewish. And we talked for about an hour, and all we talked about is music. And it set me on a kind of journey that I'm still on right now, which is looking for that different narrative, looking for that different point of view, recognizing people for their humanity rather than what they represent. Yeah.
And it's an ongoing process. One story I wanted to share about our time together. Zaki really opened my eyes to the conversation about diversity in ways that I hadn't experienced before. But it doesn't come natural. I mean, even for you it doesn't. Our first trip together to Eastern Washington, Humanities Washington was a statewide organization, so I'm getting out of a truck stop in Yakima on our way to Spokane, and Zaki's in the car, and he said, I don't want to get out, I don't feel safe here. It's that same fear you were talking about.
Yeah.
You had not been to Eastern Washington, so you were reacting to stereotypes and the narrative of fear.
Absolutely.
As we can, 2, 3, 4 trips later, you found pockets all over the state where, again, people are people, and we started to exchange ideas and cultures and have conversations. And you do some of your best work that you've done has been in Spokane now, and you have grown into that. But we actively have, you've practiced to stay with us our entire life, and we actively have to re-engage to these new experiences.
Absolutely. It really is a journey. And you can't just turn on switch on and off. It's not as simple saying, oh, we're all great, we're all equal. It's a journey. You got to keep on at, just keep at it. Whether that's through reading, whether watching movies or TV shows or listening to different kind of music, but really, really expanding your mind and going outside of your comfort zone. To me, going to Eastern Washington, that was difficult for me. My comfort zone is big cities. I'm a city boy. Amman, Beirut, New York, Seattle, all big cities. So I'm really comfortable in cities because I see the world in these cities. But I go to the rural areas, and I would be afraid. I'm like, I don't know how they're going to react to me here, stuff like that. But it took again and again, and now, because of my work, I go to Eastern Washington quite a bit. I'm going to Spokane, this month. But Yakima, one of my favorite places to be in the state right now. I love doing programs in Yakima. Yeah, but it takes work, a lot of it.
Thank you, Zaki.
Yeah, thank you.